My name is Anna ODROBINA and I'm from Krakow University of Economics in Poland. I would like to present the paper prepared for conference IBIMA in Cordoba. The paper is titled "How has the COVID-19 pandemic been driving the Slowbalisation process?" The agenda of my presentation is following. First, I would like to say some words about motivation and purpose and globalization before the pandemic. Next, I would like to present results of my research and, in the end, conclusion. The global economic crisis caused by the COVID pandemic has contributed to the structural changes in the globalization process observed in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, characterized by slowdown in the internationalization of economic activities. Scientific discussion increasingly considered an emerging new wave of globalization in the form of slowbalisation. From the point of view of economics, the pandemic triggered shock events in international economic relations, which it has had a radical impact on economic processes and severe consequences. Recent studies, reports and debates have been even considering the end of globalization. Various scholars believe those changes to be irreversible and shaping a new reality. This study aims to establish the impact of the COVID pandemic on the course of globalization. It seems that the deep corona crisis, apart from its drastic immediate effects, has been primarily speeding up structural changes in the global economy, slowly and steadily emerging for a decade. The hypothesis adopted in the paper is that the pandemic has become the flywheel of globalization due to the strengthening of previously observed changes in globalization. Discussions on globalization, a new trend in globalization, referring to a slowdown in processes of the internationalization of economic activities, date back to early 2019 under the influence of a series of articles published in The Economist. However, they were previous voices and studies describing a new course of globalization after the global financial crisis, marked by stagnation and regression in international economic relationships in conditions of global GDP growth. From 2011, the symptoms observed included slowdown in trade in goods, inward foreign direct investment, or shrinking global value chains. Globalization is marked by the weakening of traditional and conventional globalization. It means by stagnation and regression in world trade and Fdi flows, whereas other links have been growing, such as global trade in services, international trade in intangibles, global data transfers or the use of artificial intelligence, digitization, automation in international economic relations. The fundamental economic cause of globalization is the reconfiguration of global value chains, previously developed strongly by transnational corporations. Faced with the new conditions, also in connection with ongoing digitalization, global value chains needed rebuilding in order to streamline the organization of international production. Transnational corporations became exposed to increasing risks resulting from the complexity and non-transparency of the production process, as well as to pressure from local competitors. Corporations clearly took measures aimed to shorten and simplify their global value chains, also to regionalize them for increased operating speed and efficiency. Previously, corporations excessively expanded their global value chains, causing hyperglobalizations. Effects on global value changes could be seen in the stagnation of world imports of intermediate goods and in a decline from 2011 in the share of the foreign value added content of global exports of goods and services. Other major driving forces in globalization slowdown have also been political factors like growth of protectionism, restrictions against some enterprises like Huawei, US trade war with China, or Brexit. The effects of the shock and the great lockdown included closing borders, severing trade flows and supply chains, the disappearance of international travel and decreased demand for consumer goods in particular economies. A number of countries shut down factories, offices and shops, blocking supplier access to customer. The global economy was nearly paralyzed and political tension could be seen between countries. Especially in the first and second quarters of 2020, the situation pointed to a dramatic fall in world trade. But the following 2 quarters of the year saw better results and, ultimately, in 2020, trade in goods dropped by 6%, whereas trade in services went down by 16.5%. In the second half of 2020, growth in the trade in goods was associated with the necessity to secure supplies of medical products and foodstuffs, but also with the launch of supply chains. The improvement in trade in goods was driven by developing countries, mostly China, whose export in some industries even showed growth in 2020. As regards the dramatic fall in trade in services, it was mostly caused by the collapse of tourism-related services, transport and travel. In 2020, global Fdi flows dropped by as much as 42%. It must be pointed out that it was the lowest level from 2004, with a similar scale of decrease noted in 2001. The decrease in FDI mostly hit advanced economies, receiving a mere $229 billion. At the same time, inwards FDI in developing countries dropped by 20% to $616 billion. As the world's top performer, China attracted FDI worth $163 billion to high-tech industries and pharmaceuticals. India noted increased FDI in the digital sector. Trade in goods as a share of GDP decreased to a level lower than the 2009 proportion, whereas that of trade in services fell to the 2011 level. FDI as a share of GDP fell to approximately 1%, a level not recorded after 1995. It must be pointed out that the consequences of the pandemic time will have long-term effects on the shape of globalization, and recovering from the crisis will be very different from previous experiences. It seems that the post-pandemic period will be marked by the strengthened trend of slowbalisation, as the crisis has exposed all the previous problems with maintaining hyperglobalization. The key issue is international production in extensive supply chains, which caused major difficulties in the functioning of transnational corporations during the pandemic shock. Corporations found themselves faced with losses and difficulties arising from the existence organization of international production. The impact of the pandemic on supply chains varies between industries. It depends on the chain structure as well. Strongly fragmented and extensive chains have been hit the most, whereas the more digitized and automated ones have suffered less severe losses. Transnational corporations have begun to rearrange their previous organization of supply chains by diversifying supplier databases, reshoring production, and introducing automation. The transformation processes launched in global value chains clearly aim to shorten them, reduce fragmentation, and increase geographic concentration. The shift in corporate strategies will result in permanent changes in international production models. Another factor to drive the globalization trend in long term is the radical policy shift by various governments, turning to their national economies as protectionism and promoting self-sufficiency increases. Many countries responded to the pandemic shock by imposing bans on exports of medical devices, personal protective equipment, and pharmaceuticals. Governments began to consider whether they control strategic sectors. Under the influence of the pandemic, policymakers have changed their attitude to globalization and integration, with important consequences for economic policy pursued. Policymakers have been generally noting problems in trade interdependence, turning to the inwards economies. A third element of permanent changes is the leap in the development of digital technologies and automation. At the same time, the pandemic has spurred digitization on an unusual scale. Due to the digital solution, business and social activities could be continued on a remote basis. The acceleration of digital transition in conditions of the present crisis is related to the urge to avoid an economic slump, survive, or recover from the crisis situation. Digital solutions have played a key role in telemedicine, telework, online education, and maintaining social relations in the day of the lockdown. Enterprises needed to quickly adopt the digital technologies to continue functioning. Firms were forced to speed up previously implemented changes or to rebuild their business models and introduce digital innovation in their operations. Electronic commerce has also been experiencing a pandemic revolution, but it varies between industries. The most significant increases in turnover were noted by supermarkets and retail tech companies. In 2020, the value of online shopping in Europe went up by 50%, in Asia by 70%, whereas in North America by 120%. The corona crisis has increased the role of online communicators like Zoom or Google Meet, social media, marketing platforms, or digital services. Concluding, it must be confirmed that the pandemic has become the flywheel of Slowbalisation process. It has strengthened all the previously observed symptoms of the new wave of globalization. The previous trend of Slowbalisation in global trade in goods and services, FDI, global value chains and economic policy, and also the digital revolution has been accelerated and reinforced. You can see the pandemic impact on the scale and pace of globalization on the table following. Thank you for your attention.